"Dirty boots belong in the corral, not here," shouted the Millionaire CEO, Ricardo, expelling the old farmer who dared to ask for a table at his luxury restaurant in São Paulo. Humiliated in front of everyone, the farmer did not argue. He simply took his old cell phone, made a single call and said, "Hello, cancel the delivery for Dom Patricio." Ricardo heard the name of his own restaurant and laughed, until the farmer mentioned the name of his farm, and the CEO fell to his knees begging. The air in Aureus was dense, almost palpable, heavy with the scent of success and the discreet gleam of gold that adorned every detail, from the cutlery to the frames of the abstract paintings on the dark mahogany walls. From his mezzanine, a kind of throne of glass and brushed steel, Richard surveyed his kingdom. Every occupied table was a testament to his genius, his vision. He didn't just sell food, he sold status, an experience of exclusivity that the wealthiest men and women in New York City paid fortunes to feel. His restaurant wasn't a business. It was an empire, a monument to his own ambition, built on a single pillar, the beef from Golden Valley Ranch, a mythical delicacy, so tender it melted in your mouth, a secret guarded by a supplier no one had ever seen. This product was the foundation of his entire net worth, the seed investment that had blossomed into an inexhaustible source of profit and prestige. On that Friday night, the cash flow was extraordinary. The main dining room vibrated with the energy of hushed conversations, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the soft strains of a grand piano in the background. Richard smiled, a thin, satisfied smirk. He saw his clients not as people, but as stocks on the Nasdaq, each one representing another digit in his bank account. They were judges, crypto entrepreneurs, heiresses to vast fortunes in dollars and euros, all of them there, surrendered to the flavor that only he could offer. Suddenly, his gaze, trained to detect any imperfection in his tapestry of opulence, locked onto a dissonant point at the entrance. A man who did not belong. He was old, with skin weathered by the sun and a body stooped by time. His clothes were rumpled, and his sturdy, worn boots were covered in a layer of red dust, the dust of a long journey down dirt roads. The maitre d', impeccable in his tuxedo, hesitated, blocking the man's path with an icy politeness. But the old man, with a calmness that bordered on stubbornness, simply asked for a table for one. The scene was an outrage, a smudge of dirty reality in the sterile, luxurious world Richard had crafted. Fury rose in his throat like bile. Who did this man think he was? Desecrating his sacred temple of capital, with hard, decisive steps, he descended the spiral staircase, the sound of his Italian shoes echoing in the silence that was beginning to form around the entrance. He would make a spectacle of this, a lesson for anyone who dared to challenge the rules of his universe. He stopped inches from the man, the smell of earth and sweat offending his nostrils. "Friend, I think you have the wrong address. The staff entrance is around back," Richard sneered, his voice loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. The old man didn't flinch, just met his gaze with eyes that seemed to carry the wisdom and patience of the land itself. Seeing that his humiliation had no effect, Richard lost control. "Security!" he yelled, the sound echoing through the now silent room. "Dirty boots belong in a corral, not in here. Get this man out of my sight." Publicly humiliated, the man they called Ben didn't shrink. Instead, in a slow, deliberate gesture, he reached into his pants pocket and pulled out an old flip phone, a simple, buttoned model. Completely ignoring the CEO and the approaching security guards, he dialed a number and brought the phone to his ear under the astonished gaze of everyone present. "Hey, son, it's me. Go ahead and cancel next week's delivery to the restaurant, Aureus, here in New York." Ben's voice was calm, without a hint of anger or hesitation, which made it all the more cutting in the ensuing silence. Richard, who was watching with a mocking smirk plastered on his face, felt a prick of irritation. The old man's audacity was unbelievable. threatening him in his own sanctuary. He took a step forward, ready to snatch the phone from the man's hand and smash it on the floor. "What do you think you're doing? Threatening me?" he hissed, his voice laced with venom. But Ben continued, as if Richard were just background noise. A fly buzzing in the air. "No, cancel the whole contract. Permanent," he said, pausing for what felt like an eternity. "The owner here doesn't like the smell of our ranch. Guess the beef from Golden Valley isn't good enough for him." The name, that name, Golden Valley Ranch. The words hit Richard not like a sound, but like a physical shockwave. The arrogant smirk on his lips froze and shattered, replaced by a mask of disbelief and panic. His face, once flushed with fury, turned as white as the linen tablecloths. The air fled his lungs. Golden Valley Ranch, the mythical source of his wealth, the pillar upon which his entire business empire was built. The supplier was a legend, a ghost known only as the Cattle King, a man who never showed his face, who dealt through intermediaries and demanded almost reverential respect. The idea that this man, with his dusty boots and simple clothes, could be the architect of his entire fortune was so absurd, so impossible, that his mind refused to process it. But the old man's eyes, those calm, steady eyes, held no lie. They told a truth as solid and unshakable as the earth he came from. The buzz in the room turned into a heavy, oppressive silence. All eyes, previously divided between pity for the old man and contempt for Richard, were now fixed on the CEO, watching every drop of color and arrogance drain from his face. Ben ended the call with a soft click and put the phone back in his pocket. He looked at Richard, not with triumph, but with a kind of quiet assessment, like a rancher judging the weather. Richard's body began to tremble, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that started in his hands and spread through his entire being. You can't do this," he stammered, his voice a wisp of what it was. Stripped of all its authority, raw, primal desperation took over. "My career, my restaurant, my net worth, it all depends on your beef." Each word was a confession of his fragility, a public admission that he, the great Richard, was nothing more than a man dependent on the one he had just humiliated. Ben just adjusted his wide-brimmed hat, a simple gesture that carried the weight of a final sentence. "Depended," he corrected, the word dropping like a stone into the well of silence. It was enough. Richard's last fiber of pride snapped. In front of his most important clients, food critics, and the investors he courted, he broke. His knees hit the polished marble with a dull thud, and he clung with both hands to the dusty pant leg of the rancher. "No! For God's sake, I'm begging you, don't cancel. I'll do anything. I'll give you the restaurant," he pleaded, his voice choked with a panicked sob. Ben looked down at the multimillionaire clinging to his boot like a castaway to a piece of driftwood. His expression didn't change. "I don't want your restaurant," he said, his voice still gentle. "I just wanted dinner." The echo of Ben's words, "I just wanted dinner," hung in the air like a haze, thicker and more suffocating than the smoke from an expensive cigar. They were simple, devoid of any malice, and for that very reason, annihilating. They stripped Richard's cruelty bare, exposing it under the golden lights of the dining room for all to see. Clinging to the dusty pants, Richard couldn't process the refusal. In his world, everything had a price: money, power, influence. They were the universal currencies that opened all doors. He had offered his restaurant, the jewel in his crown, the most valuable asset in his business portfolio. Such an offer could not be refused. "Please," he whispered, his voice hoarse, pathetic. "I have money, a lot of money. I can make a new investment in your ranch. I can buy all your shares. I can top any offer. Name a price. Everything has a price." His mind, accustomed to calculating the profit and loss of every transaction, was now racing, trying to find a financial instrument that could reverse this disaster. He saw bar graphs plummeting in his mind, the restaurant's cash flow drying up, his brand value crashing faster than a panicked crypto market. Meanwhile, the audience's silence began to break. The initial shock gave way to a collective murmur, a buzz of gossip and judgment that spread from table to table. Cell phones, previously pocketed, began to emerge discreetly. A subtle flash went off in the corner of the room. Richard's humiliation was being documented, ready to become the talk of the elite circles the next day. More devastating to his status than any stock market crash. Lucy, the restaurant manager and Richard's right hand for years, finally broke her inertia. Her face was pale, but her posture was impeccable as she approached, moving with a grace that contrasted with the chaos of the scene. "Mr. Thorne, please get up," she said in a low but firm voice, trying to preserve a last shred of her boss's dignity. She placed a hand on his shoulder, but he brushed it away, his eyes fixed on Ben, as if the old man were the only thing in the universe. He was the key to saving not just his assets, but his very identity. Without Aureus, what was he? Just another multi-millionaire in a city full of them. Ben looked at the man unraveling at his feet. His gaze held no contempt, not even anger. There was a deep sadness there, a weariness. With a slow gesture, he took Richard's hands, which were trembling like leaves, and gently detached them from his pants. The force Richard used was that of desperation. Ben's was that of serenity, and therefore infinitely stronger. He said nothing more. The words had been spoken. He just took a step back, creating an impassable distance between their two worlds. Then he turned. The crowd, that sea of wealth and power, parted for him. No one dared to touch him. No one dared to speak. They just watched as the man in the dusty boots walked with steady, unhurried steps toward the grand oak door. Each step was the beat of a gavel, sealing the fate of Richard's empire. The sound of the door closing behind Ben was soft, but to Richard, it sounded like the explosion that brought his world down. He remained there, on his knees, in the middle of the room, the silence now filled with merciless whispers. Lucy was trying to speak to him, but her voice was a distant buzz. Richard's brain had disconnected from the immediate reality and focused on a single, desperate possibility. With hands still trembling, he tore his smartphone from his pocket, almost dropping it. His clumsy fingers slid across the glowing screen, searching for a name in his contact list. Julian, Golden Valley intermediary. He had to call. He had to reverse this. He refused to believe that all his capital, his entire legacy of hard work and arrogance, could be undone by an old man and an unoffered apology. He pressed the call button, his heart hammering against his ribs, and brought the phone to his ear, praying for a miracle. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, each ring a hammer blow on the anvil of Richard's anxiety. Finally, a dry, professional voice answered, "Julian." It was the intermediary, Richard's only link to the mythical Golden Valley Ranch. "Ah, Julian, thank God. It was a misunderstanding, a terrible, terrible misunderstanding," Richard blurted out, his voice trembling, the words tumbling over each other in his desperate haste. "That man, I didn't know who he was. You have to talk to him, explain. I'll pay double, triple. I'll top any offer he gets, offer him a new contract with guaranteed interest and dividends. We can turn this into a new business line, a partnership." He was offering what always worked: more money, more capital, the promise of even greater returns. On the other end of the line, there was a heavy silence, a silence that said more than any words could. "Richard," Julian began, his voice now devoid of any warmth, "there's nothing to be done." "No, there has to be," Richard pleaded. "Money solves everything." "Not this," Julian replied, his voice sharp. "You don't understand who you're dealing with, Mr. Ben. He doesn't have a boss. He doesn't answer to a board. He is Golden Valley Ranch. He built it from nothing, with his own 2 hands. His word is the only law out there. The decision is his, and it's final." The call ended with a definitive click. The smartphone slipped from Richard's sweaty hand and fell to the marble floor with a dull thud. The sound, however, barely registered in his mind. He was plunged into a new kind of silence, a cold vacuum where the only thing that existed was the confirmation of his ruin. It wasn't a nightmare, it was real. He had, in a single act of blind arrogance, destroyed the most valuable asset of his empire. Lucy, seeing her boss's complete collapse, acted with the efficiency of a general on a battlefield. With a discreet gesture, she dismissed the security guards who were still hovering awkwardly and addressed the nearest tables. "Ladies and gentlemen, my apologies for the disruption. All drinks are on the house tonight," she said, her voice calm and controlled, a balm on the tense atmosphere. She then approached Richard, who was still on his knees, a statue of despair. "Richard, get up, now," she ordered in a fierce whisper. Her firm hand on his arm forced him to obey. He moved like an automaton, his eyes glazed, allowing her to guide him away from the prying eyes, up the spiral staircase to the safety of his office. As soon as the door closed, Richard's facade of strength disintegrated completely. He collapsed into his Italian leather chair, the same one from which he had surveyed his kingdom with such pride hours before. "It's over, Lucy. Everything," he murmured, running his hands over his face. "Years of work. My net worth evaporated in 5 minutes." Lucy crossed her arms, the sympathy on her face giving way to a restrained frustration. "Your net worth? Richard, there are 50 employees downstairs whose jobs depend on this place. We have contracts with suppliers, reservations for the next 6 months. Your personal assets are the least of our problems right now. We need to do damage control, assess the full liability." He barely heard her. His eyes wandered around the office. A shrine to his own ego, adorned with awards and magazine clippings praising his business acumen. It all looked like trash now. His mind raced, searching for a way out, a loophole, anything. He could not accept defeat. Suddenly, his gaze fixed on a large, decorative world map that covered one of the walls. He stood up, staggering, and approached the map, his fingers tracing the highways leading out of New York City toward the country's interior. A crazy idea, a plan born of pure desperation, began to form in his mind. He turned to Lucy, his eyes gleaming with a new, feverish intensity. "I'm going after him," he declared, his voice hoarse. "I'm going to that damn ranch. I'm going to fix this." Lucy looked at Richard as if he had just announced he was going to fly to the moon. "Go after him." "Richard, have you lost your mind?" she questioned, her voice a mix of disbelief and concern. "You don't know where this ranch is. Nobody knows. Julian was our only contact, and he made it clear the decision is final. You show up there uninvited, and you'll only make things worse." But her logic couldn't penetrate the armor of desperation surrounding Richard. Inaction was torture. To stay here in his luxurious office while his empire crumbled was unthinkable. The need to do something, anything, consumed him. "I'll find out," he said, determination hardening his voice. "There are ways, contracts, records, invoices. Some document must have an address, an LLC filing, some clue. I'm a billionaire, or at least I was an hour ago. I have resources. I can hire the best private investigators. I can track the deliveries. I will find him." He began to pace, his mind already working, formulating a plan of action. The humiliation in the dining room had broken him, but now, facing total annihilation, a fierce survival instinct was beginning to emerge from the ashes of his pride. Lucy sighed, realizing it was useless to argue. She knew that look on his face, the same blind stubbornness that had helped him build his fortune and had now led him to the brink of the abyss. "And what are you going to say when you get there, if you even get there?" she pressed, trying one last time to bring him to his senses. "Offer more money." We already saw how well that worked. The question hit him. For a moment, the feverish energy wavered. Lucy was right. What would he say? Sorry for treating you like dirt. I was wrong. The words felt foreign, awkward in his mouth. He wasn't a man who apologized. He was a man who signed checks. I don't know, he admitted, his voice dropping to a murmur. But I have to try. I have to look him in the eye again. It wasn't just about the business. He realized in that instant it was about something deeper. Ben's calm had disarmed him in a way no business rival ever had. There was an authority in that old rancher, a wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars or Bitcoin. And Richard, for the first time in his life, felt genuinely poor in comparison. As Richard was lost in thought, the office door opened and a young waiter, Matthew, appeared, his face pale and hesitant. "Mr. Thorne, sorry to bother you, but the video is already online." Richard and Lucy looked at each other, the same dread mirrored in their eyes. Lucy quickly grabbed her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen. In seconds, she found it. A major celebrity news portal had already posted the clip, filmed from a discreet but clear angle. The headline was merciless. "Millionaire CEO on his knees. The fall of the King of Aureus." The humiliation was no longer private. It was viral. A notification of the drop in his restaurant holding company's stock value flashed on the screen. "This is going to destroy our brand," Lucy whispered, horrified. For Richard, however, the video was a catalyst. The public shaming, the impending financial loss, it all solidified into a single resolution. He would not be remembered as the man on his knees in the video. He would rewrite the end of this story. He looked at Lucy, his eyes cold and determined. "Get my car ready and start digging. Look for anything connected to Golden Valley Ranch. I don't care what it costs. I'm leaving in an hour." The hunt had begun. He didn't know where he was going or what he would find, but one thing was certain. He wasn't giving up. He would cross the country if he had to, not just to save his empire, but to confront the man who, with a few calm words, had shown him just how fragile his world of gold truly was. Dawn found Richard on the highway, a solitary figure inside a bubble of luxury and technology slicing through the darkness. The V12 engine of his imported sedan whispered, devouring the asphalt of the interstate that led him away from the glare of New York City toward the unknown heart of the country. He had been driving for hours, fueled by caffeine and a feverish determination. Beside him, on the passenger seat, a tablet displayed a constant stream of information sent by Lucy and the team of private investigators he had hired at great expense. The first few hours were frustrating. Golden Valley Ranch was a digital ghost. It had no website, no social media presence, and the LLC was registered under an almost impenetrable investment holding company, a labyrinth of names and shell corporations designed to ensure anonymity. It was a fortress of privacy, and Richard E., a man who believed that everything and everyone could be bought or exposed, felt powerless as he drove. Flashes of the previous night assaulted him. The image of himself on his knees, the sound of the whispers, Ben's tranquil gaze. Each memory was a blow to his already wounded ego. He tried to push the thoughts away, focusing on the logistical problem, the search, but the humiliation was a throbbing wound. He wasn't just a businessman trying to save his capital. He was a dethroned king in search of his executioner. Around 4 in the morning, a new email from Lucy flashed on the screen. The subject was a single word, lead. Richard's heart raced. The email contained an attachment, an old, low-resolution photo taken from a regional newspaper article from almost 20 years ago. The headline read, "Small-time producer from New Hope, Texas, wins National Livestock Award." In the photo, a much younger, but unmistakably Ben, smiled next to a prize-winning bull. He wore the same kind of hat. The text mentioned Golden Valley Ranch, located on the outskirts of the small, remote town of New Hope. New Hope. Richard typed the name into the car's navigation system. The result made him swallow hard. It was over 1,000 miles away, in a part of the state he barely knew existed. A tangle of county roads and dirt tracks, it was the back of beyond, but it was a direction, a destination. It was hope. He floored the accelerator, the engine responding with a powerful roar. The landscape around him began to change subtly. The 24-hour gas stations and large distribution centers gave way to longer stretches of darkness, to small, sleeping towns whose lights were just a blur in the window. Richard's world, made of air-conditioned boardrooms and digital transactions, was dissolving, being replaced by something rawer, more real. He felt like a foreigner, an invader in a land he didn't understand. During a stop to refuel at a roadside truck stop, he went into the convenience store. The clerk, a sleepy young man, looked at Richard's rumpled suit and his expensive car with blatant curiosity. Richard ordered a coffee and, while waiting, saw his own face on the small TV hanging in the corner. It was the news report about the incident at Aureus. The clerk looked from the TV to Richard, his eyes widening in recognition. Richard grabbed the coffee, threw a $100 bill on the counter without waiting for change, and hurried out, his face burning with shame. The fame he had so carefully cultivated was now his prison. He got back in the car, the isolation of its leather interior feeling more fragile than ever. The search for Ben was no longer just a business mission. It had become an escape from himself and the world he had created, a world that now judged and laughed at his fall. He looked at the dark road ahead, feeling more lost than ever, but knowing that the only way to go was forward, toward the small town that held the secret of the man who had destroyed him. The sun rose lazily, painting the sky in shades of orange and revealing a landscape Richard only knew from documentaries. The smooth asphalt of the main interstate had turned into a two-lane highway, patched and winding, that snaked through green hills and endless pastures. The air coming through the open window didn't smell of pollution, but of damp earth and vegetation. It was an alien world. Around 8 in the morning, exhausted and on edge, he saw the sign, "Welcome to New Hope." The town was exactly what the name suggested, small, simple, with a central square, a church with a tall steeple, and a handful of cobblestone streets. Luxury cars like his were clearly an anomaly here. Every head turned to watch him pass, the gazes a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. He parked in front of the town's only diner, the smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon wafting through the air. He felt absurdly out of place in his designer suit, now wrinkled and stained with coffee. Inside the diner, time seemed to have stopped in the 80s. A group of older men, wearing cowboy hats and worn jeans, were drinking coffee at a wooden counter, their conversations ceasing the moment Richard walked in. He approached the counter, trying to force an air of casualness he didn't feel. "Morning. I'm looking for a property, the Golden Valley Ranch. Can you tell me where it is?" he asked. The men exchanged glances. One of them, with a thick mustache and shrewd eyes, sized him up before answering. "Golden Valley? Never heard of it." The answer was obviously a lie, delivered with a naturalness that made it a brick wall. Richard tried again. "It belongs to a gentleman named Ben." The silence that followed was even heavier. The man with the mustache took a sip of his coffee. "Lots of Bens around here, mister. And a lot of ranches. Gonna be hard to help you." Richard felt his frustration mounting. This little town was a fortress, more impenetrable than his corporate lawyers. He realized his approach was all wrong. His money, his status, his New York City arrogance meant nothing here. In fact, they were liabilities. He walked out of the diner and leaned against his car, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on him. He was at a dead end. It was then that a young woman, whom he had noticed sweeping the sidewalk in front of a small flower shop, approached him. She had kind eyes and a shy smile. "Are you lost, sir?" she asked. "I'm looking for Mr. Ben," he replied, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance. tinged only with exhaustion. "It's very important that I speak with him." The young woman studied him for a moment. "My name is Anna. Ben is my grandfather." Richard's jaw dropped. The encounter, so casual. "I felt like a miracle." "Your grandfather? Can you take me to him? Please, it's a matter of life or business. A very serious business matter." Anna hesitated, her smile fading. "I know who you are. I saw the video. The whole town has—" Richard's face burned. Of course they had. That was a mistake. A terrible mistake. "I need to fix it." He didn't know why he was being so honest with this stranger, but he felt it was his only chance. Anna looked at the man before her. He didn't look like the arrogant monster from the video. He just looked like a desperate and very, very tired man. "He's not at the ranch," she said, and Richard's heart sank. "He went to the regional hospital in the next town over. My grandmother, Eleanor, she took a bad turn last night. I think it's her heart." The revelation hit Richard with the force of a punch. It wasn't about business. It wasn't about a cancelled contract, Ben's calm, his hurry to leave. He was worried about his wife. Richard's world spun. He, who had built an empire on the premise that everything was about money, profit, and power, was confronted by a brutally simple and human reality. The man he had humiliated was facing a family crisis, perhaps the greatest of his life, while he, Richard, had driven across the country worried about his net worth. The futility of his journey, the smallness of his problems, crushed him. "The hospital," he repeated, his voice a whisper. Is she okay?" Anna shrugged, her eyes filling with tears. "We don't know yet. Grandpa's been there with her since early this morning." Suddenly, the restaurant, the contract, the video, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the image of an old man, sitting alone in a hospital corridor, waiting for news about his wife. And that's where Richard knew he had to go, not as a CEO looking to reverse a loss, but as a man who was perhaps, for the first time, beginning to understand the true meaning of wealth. Anna's information about his grandmother in the hospital didn't just change the course of Richard's journey, it demolished the very foundation of his motivation. He was no longer on a mission to save his business. The desperate quest for profit and the attempt to reverse a catastrophic loss suddenly seemed shamefully insignificant. The heart. A single word that recontextualized everything. While he was worrying about his cash flow, his stock value, the stain on his reputation, a man he had humiliated was dealing with the possibility of losing the person he loved. The wealth Richard had amassed, his vast portfolio of assets and investments, now seemed like a useless pile of dust before the magnitude of a real, human problem. He felt like a fool, a man who had spent his entire life counting the money in his vault without realizing the door to real life was locked. Anna gave him directions to the regional hospital in Silver Creek, the neighboring town, and he drove on autopilot. The car, which had always been his symbol of power and status, now felt like an opulent, ridiculous cage. He remembered his own relationships, the 2 failed marriages that had cost him a fortune in settlements. He saw his ex-wives and his distant children as liabilities on his personal balance sheet, drains on his resources. It had never occurred to him to think about the emotional value, the investment of affection he had failed to make. He had a fortune in dollars, but his human capital was zero. He was, he realized with painful clarity, emotionally bankrupt. The Silver Creek Hospital was a simple building with faded paint, with a steady stream of ordinary people coming and going, their faces marked by worry, pain, or fragile hope. There were no valets, no red carpets, no gleaming glass doors. Just the smell of antiseptic and the muffled sound of anxious conversations. No one there cared who he was or how much money he had. He walked in, feeling more exposed and inadequate than when he was on his knees in his own restaurant. He asked for Eleanor, the name of Ben's wife, from a tired-looking nurse who pointed him toward a small waiting area at the end of the hall. And there he was, sitting in an orange plastic chair, slumped over. Ben looked like a smaller, more fragile version of the man who had faced him the night before. His hat was in his lap, held by calloused hands that trembled slightly. He was staring intently at a closed door, the one Richard assumed led to the intensive care unit. He wasn't the cattle king, the invisible titan of business. He was just a husband, terrified and alone. Richard walked slowly, the sound of his expensive shoes echoing profanely in the quiet hallway. He stopped a few feet away, his heart pounding. What would he say? That he was sorry. The word felt empty, insufficient, that he wanted to help. How could his money fix a broken heart, literally or figuratively? He took a deep breath, the hospital air scratching his lungs. "Mr. Ben," he said, his voice barely audible. The old man took a moment to react, as if emerging from a very distant place. He turned his head slowly. His eyes, red and weary, met Richard's. There was no anger, no surprise, just infinite exhaustion. He recognized him, and a shadow of what might have been a sad smile touched his lips. Then he spoke, his voice hoarse and low, but each word hitting Richard like a stone. "You here to collect on dinner, son?" Ben's question, soft and tinged with a melancholy irony, completely disarmed Richard. "You here to collect on dinner, son?" For a moment, the multimillionaire CEO, the man who commanded boardrooms with an iron fist, didn't know what to say. The entire journey, the frantic search for Golden Valley Ranch, had been reshaped in the last few hours, and the old man's question only highlighted how pathetic his original motivation was. He felt his face burn, not with anger, but with a deep, overwhelming shame. "No, sir," he stammered, his voice low and hoarse. "No, I was in New Hope. Your granddaughter, Anna, she told me about your wife. I'm so sorry. Truly." He sat in one of the plastic chairs, a respectful distance away, the gesture awkward and uncertain. The silence settled in again, broken only by the distant hum of electronic equipment and the sound of hurried footsteps in the hall. For Richard, that silence was more deafening than the shouts on any stock exchange floor. Ben didn't answer immediately. He continued to stare at the closed door, as if his willpower could pass through it and heal the woman inside. After a long moment, he sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime. 52 years, he said, more to himself than to Richard. 52 years we've gone to sleep and woken up next to each other. Now that is an asset. It's not the money, not the property. It's the time you build up together. The simple but profound words were like tiny needles puncturing Richard's bubble of arrogance. He thought of his own life, the assets he'd accumulated, the deals he'd closed. He had an enviable cash flow, a diversified investment portfolio. But he didn't have 52 years of accumulated time with anyone. He had nothing. "I can't even imagine your pain, sir," Richard said. And for the first time in decades, he was being completely sincere, with no ulterior motive. A doctor came out of the door, his expression tired. He addressed Ben with a professional kindness, explaining the situation in technical terms Richard barely understood. Talking about arrhythmia, catheterization, and the need for more advanced equipment. The gist, however, was clear. Eleanor was stable, but she needed a procedure that this hospital was not equipped to perform. Richard stood up, feeling an urgency that had nothing to do with business. "Doctor," he interrupted, "what's the best place in the country for this kind of procedure?" The doctor, surprised by the interruption, looked at the well-dressed man. "Probably the Mayo Clinic or Mount Sinai in New York. But the transfer is the problem. A medevac helicopter, the logistics of getting an emergency ICU bed. It's complex and extremely expensive." Ben lowered his head, the weight of helplessness falling on his shoulders. Money, which he had never valued, had now become an insurmountable barrier. In that instant, Richard saw a path. Not a path to get his contract back, but one to reclaim a piece of his own humanity. He couldn't fix what he had done with arrogance, but he could use the resources his arrogance had afforded him to do something good. He took out his cell phone, the same device that represented his power and his ruin. His fingers moved with a speed and precision he normally reserved for closing multi-million-dollar deals. He found the personal number of the director of one of New York's most prestigious hospitals, a man he played golf with. Ignoring the confused look of the doctor and Ben's silent despair, he made the call. "Arthur, it's Richard. I need a favor, a very big one. This isn't about an investment, not about gold or crypto. It's about a life." On the other end of the line, Arthur's voice, normally a smooth baritone used to negotiating investment funds and political favors, was hesitant. "Richard, you know how complicated this is. An ICU bed isn't something you can just conjure up, and an interstate air transfer." But Richard cut him off. The authority in his voice no longer that of an arrogant CEO, but of a man on an unwavering mission. "Arthur, I'm not asking. I'm calling in every chip. All the influential capital we've built together. Think of the investments I made in your expansion fund, the business I've directed your way. Forget the money, forget the profits. This is different. Her name is Eleanor. She needs us." There was a pause. Richard could almost hear the gears in Arthur's mind calculating the pros and cons, not in financial terms, but in terms of power and debt. Finally, Arthur relented. "Give me an hour. I'll move heaven and earth." Richard hung up, his chest heaving as if he'd run a marathon. The local doctor was staring at him with an expression of pure astonishment, as if he had just witnessed an act of magic. In his 30 years of practice, he had never seen resources of this magnitude mobilized with a single phone call. It was a glimpse into a universe where wealth opened doors that, for most people, remained forever shut. But Ben's gaze was far more complex. There was confusion, suspicion, and underneath it all, a spark of hope he seemed to be fighting to extinguish, as if it were a betrayal to accept it from this man. "A medevac is on its way," Richard said, his voice softer. "They're bringing her to New York. The best bed, the best team, everything will be ready." Ben shook his head, his wounded pride fighting a losing battle with the fear in his heart. "I can't accept this," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. "I have no way to pay for something like this. The ranch provides a good living, but I'm not a man of luxury. I don't want your charity." Richard took a step forward, his hands open in a gesture of supplication. "This isn't charity," he said, the words coming from a place he didn't know existed inside him. "And it has nothing to do with money. I owe you a debt that no amount can repay. Consider this a down payment with interest. Please let me do this for your wife." In that moment, in the sterile corridor of a rural hospital, Richard understood the true nature of assets and liabilities. His humiliation of Ben was a liability on his soul, and this act was the only investment that could generate any return for his character. A low, pulsating sound began to be heard in the distance, growing rapidly. The sound of rotor blades chopping the air. Help was coming. The promise had become reality. The sound filled the silence, an overwhelming and undeniable force. Ben looked out the window, seeing the silhouette of the medical aircraft against the blue sky. Hope, finally, won the battle against pride. He turned to Richard, his eyes moist, his expression hard but resolved. He didn't say thank you. Instead, he imposed his own terms, redefining the rules of their strange agreement. "I accept," he said, his voice grave. "But on one condition, you come with us. You'll stay in New York until my Eleanor walks out of that hospital. You don't just get to sign a check and turn your back. You're going to see this through to the end." Ben's condition struck Richard with unexpected force. It wasn't a request for money, property, or a new contract for his ranch. It was a demand for time, for presence, for a human investment. Richard, the man who paid fortunes for assistants to manage his schedule and solve his problems, was being summoned to simply be there. It was a demand his net worth couldn't satisfy, and for that very reason, the most valuable of all. "I will," Richard answered, without a hint of hesitation. The decision was instantaneous, an impulse that came from the depths of his recent transformation. The logistics of the transfer were a whirlwind of efficiency, a spectacle of what money and influence could buy. In less than 2 hours, Eleanor, stabilized and monitored by an elite medical team, was moved from the small hospital to the medevac helicopter. Richard handled everything. His CEO mind, accustomed to managing complex operations, taking over. He coordinated with the hospital in New York, spoke with Anna to reassure the family, and arranged for Ben to accompany his wife. During the flight, the deafening roar of the rotors prevented any conversation. Sitting on a small fold-down seat, Richard observed the scene. On one side, the medical team worked with focused calm, the monitors beeping in a steady rhythm that seemed to mark the very pulse of life. On the other, Ben held his sleeping wife's hand, his face a mask of worry, but his eyes never leaving her face. He whispered words Richard couldn't hear, but whose meaning was universal. In that confined space, thousands of feet in the air, Richard's vast wealth seemed irrelevant. The real treasure there was the bond between these two people, a legacy of affection built over half a century. When they arrived in New York, an ambulance was already waiting on the helipad. The transfer to the hospital was seamless. Eleanor was immediately taken to the ICU suite, a room that looked more like a luxury hotel, with state-of-the-art equipment and a medical team waiting. Richard led Ben to a private waiting room, a comfortable space with leather armchairs and a panoramic view of the city. The contrast with the hospital in Silver Creek was stark, but the worry on Ben's face was the same. "Thank you," the old man said, the word coming out with difficulty, as if it were a foreign language. "I don't know how I'll ever repay this." "Don't worry about that now," Richard replied. "You need to rest." But Ben shook his head. "I'm not leaving this spot until she wakes up." Richard understood. He wouldn't either. He called Lucy, explaining the situation. "Cancel all my meetings, indefinitely," he said. A decision that 48 hours earlier would have been unthinkable. And Lucy, about the restaurant. "For now, just close the doors, say it's for renovations, pay everyone's salary in full, use my personal funds." He was, for the first time, using his fortune not to build an empire, but to protect the people who depended on him. The hours dragged on. Richard and Ben sat in silence, two men from opposite worlds, united by a crisis. Richard, who once saw time as money, began to understand it as Ben did, as a measure of life, of waiting, of hope. He learned more about business in that waiting room than in any MBA program. He learned that a man's greatest asset isn't what he owns, but what he refuses to lose. As evening fell, the head physician, the same Dr. Arthur Richard had contacted, entered the room. His face was serious, but there was a gleam of optimism in his eyes. "The procedure was a success," he said. "She's a strong woman. She responded very well. The next 24 hours are crucial, but we're very confident." A sob of relief escaped from Ben. He bent forward, his hands covering his face, his body shaking. Richard placed a hand on the old man's shoulder, a gesture of comfort that was as new to him as it was to the man receiving it. In that moment, he was not a multi-millionaire CEO, and the other was not a rancher. They were just two men, sharing the fragile, precious dividend of hope. The next 24 hours unfolded in a strange time, a limbo suspended between fear and hope. For Richard, a man whose day was meticulously divided into 15-minute blocks, each with an associated monetary value, that wait was a lesson in humility. Time here wasn't money. It was breath. It was the constant, reassuring beep of the monitors down the hall. He and Ben barely spoke, but a silent understanding grew between them. Richard arranged for food, which they hardly touched, and coffee, which they drank in mechanical sips. He watched the old rancher, whose posture never wavered, his eyes fixed on the door like a lighthouse. In that silent vigil, Richard began to take stock of his own life, not in terms of financial assets and liabilities, but of human connections. He realized his emotional net worth was an arid landscape, a desert his immense fortune could not irrigate. In the middle of the night, exhaustion broke the silence. It was Ben who spoke first, his voice low and hoarse. "When Eleanor and I bought that piece of land, we had nothing," he said, his eyes lost in a distant memory. "Our only capital was the will to work. The first investment we made wasn't with money, it was with a promise, to each other, under a fig tree, that we'd never give up. Every brick in the house, every fence post in the pasture, those aren't assets. They're witnesses to that promise." He looked at his calloused hands. "People think the wealth of Golden Valley comes from the beef, the contracts, the euros they pay for it. But it doesn't. The wealth comes from the soil, from respecting the time it takes for things to grow, a lesson the business world seems to have forgotten." Richard listened, each word dismantling the man he used to be a little more. He remembered a conversation with his own father, years ago, when he decided to sell the small family business to finance his first big, risky stock investment. His father had warned him, "Son, don't trade a treasure for a map." He hadn't understood then. Now, sitting next to Ben, he finally did. "I traded it," Richard confessed, his voice choked, surprising himself with his own honesty. "I traded everything for the map. Family, friends, 2 marriages. I saw everything as a transaction. Every relationship was a potential cash flow, and when it didn't show the expected profit, I cut my losses." He laughed, a bitter, joyless sound. The great billionaire who understands everything about returns but couldn't keep a single person by his side. "I am the poorest man I know." Ben turned and, for the first time, looked at Richard, not with the memory of humiliation, but with a deep and genuine compassion, the compassion of a man who understands suffering. He offered no empty words of comfort. Instead, he said something that changed Richard's perspective forever. "As long as there's life, there's time for a new planting, son. The soil may be dry, but it's never too late to start plowing." In that instant, a connection was forged. The debt was forgiven, and a mutual respect was born from the ashes of arrogance. The door to the waiting room opened, interrupting the moment. It was Dr. Arthur. His face, once a mask of cautious professionalism, was now lit by a frank, relieved smile. "She's awake," he announced. "She's a little groggy, but stable, and she's asking for her husband." He paused and looked directly at Richard. "And she also wants to meet the guardian angel who brought her here." Entering Eleanor's room was, for Richard, more intimidating than walking into any boardroom for a billion-dollar merger negotiation. The white door seemed like a frontier, separating the man he was from the man he was striving to become. He hesitated in the hallway, adjusting a tie he hadn't worn in 2 days, a useless gesture from an old habit. Ben, at his side, placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "She doesn't bite," the old man said, a twinkle of humor in his tired eyes. "Her heart is stronger than yours and mine put together." Richard took a deep breath and walked in. The room was bright and quiet, save for the soft beeping of the monitors. Eleanor was semi-reclined in the bed, looking frail against the white sheets, but her eyes, a lively, intelligent brown, fixed on him with a clarity that disarmed him. A gentle smile formed on her lips. "So you're the angel in a hurry from New York," she said, her voice a bit weak but melodious. Richard felt his face flush. "Mrs. Eleanor, I'm far from an angel," he said, approaching the bed. "I'm the man who caused all this. If it weren't for my arrogance, your husband wouldn't have gone through that stress. I was just trying to fix the harm I'd done." She studied him for a moment, her wisdom seeming far greater than the fragility of her body. A bad man doesn't drive across the country to fix a mistake, son. He just calculates the liabilities and moves on, she said. I know what you did for me, Ben told me. That wasn't a transaction. That was kindness. The word kindness struck him as odd. No one had ever associated it with him. He glanced at Ben, who was now holding his wife's other hand, and saw an almost imperceptible nod. That was forgiveness. I'd like to propose a new deal, Richard said, his voice firm but humble. And this time, it's not about my profit. He turned to Ben. I don't want the old contract back. I don't deserve it. And Aureus, as it was, doesn't either. That place was a monument to my vanity, built on a product whose origin I never bothered to honor. I want to close that restaurant for good. Ben and Eleanor looked at each other, surprised. And I want to open a new one in its place, Richard continued. A place called Golden Valley, a place that tells your story, where every dish celebrates the work, the land, the respect. And I don't want to be the owner. I want to be your partner. I want you to be the heart of the business, the soul, and a significant portion of all profits will be reinvested into a fund for the community of New Hope, for the school, for the health clinic. It will be a new kind of investment, one that pays dividends in dignity. He stopped, his heart laid bare, waiting for the verdict. A long silence filled the room. Eleanor squeezed her husband's hand and smiled at Richard, tears shimmering in her eyes. My Ben always said that the best inheritance you can leave isn't the fortune you accumulate, but the seeds you plant in the lives of others, she said softly. It sounds like you're ready to start your planting. Ben stood up, walked over to Richard, and extended his hand. It was not the hand of a supplier to a client, nor of the humiliated to the humiliator. It was the hand of one man to another. We have a deal, partner, he said, his grip firm and strong. In that handshake, all conflicts dissolved. The debt was paid, arrogance was replaced by purpose, and Richard's empire, once built on the capital of money, was refounded on the solid rock of human capital. He hadn't recovered a contract. He had gained a family, and in the process found his true net worth. 1 year later, the address was the same, but the place was unrecognizable. Where Aureus once stood, a cold mausoleum of marble and mahogany dedicated to ostentation, Golden Valley now flourished. The change was more than cosmetic. It was spiritual. The heavy oak door had been replaced by a glass one, always open, inviting. Inside, the decor used reclaimed wood, handcrafted pottery, and warm lighting that made everyone feel like old friends. On the walls, instead of overpriced abstract art, were large black and white photographs telling the story of the ranch, of the red soil, the calloused hands, and the genuine smiles. The aroma in the air was no longer that of intimidating wealth, but of real food, prepared with respect. And at the center of it all, moving not with the arrogance of an owner, but with the grace of a host, was Richard. He no longer wore Italian suits. He wore a simple linen shirt, sleeves rolled up, and a smile that now reached his eyes. He stopped by the table of a young couple celebrating an anniversary, exchanged a few kind words, and discreetly signaled a waiter to send them a complimentary dessert. His former self would have seen that table only in terms of its average check, a number on his cash flow statement. Now, he saw a story. He was no longer in the business of selling status. He was in the business of creating memories. His gaze moved to the best table in the restaurant, near a window overlooking a small garden. There, seated like the royalty they truly were Ben and Eleanor, who had come to New York for a routine checkup and to celebrate the restaurant's first anniversary. Beside them was Anna, who now managed the Seeds of Hope Community Fund, financed by a percentage of the profit from every dish served. Richard walked over and sat with them. The house is full again, partner, Ben said with a grin. Yes, Richard replied. But the wealth is different today. He looked around at the happy buzz of the dining room. I used to measure my success in net worth, in my stock value, in the price of the dollar. It was an empty fortune. Today, my greatest asset is the sound of this laughter. The real treasure is knowing that the new health clinic in New Hope opened last week. That's the kind of return on investment